Hi, I'm Joe Shaw. Good afternoon. I'm with the Colorado Foothills World Affairs Council, welcoming you to this very special program being jointly sponsored by my organization, WorldDenver, the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council, and the University of Denver's Korbel Center for U.S.-China Cooperation. Before we start, I hope all of us are unified in deploring the rise of anti-Asian hatred we have all been shocked by recently. It must stop. First, I would like to introduce the Colorado Foothills World Affairs Council President, Deb Pierce, to say a few words. Deb?
Thank you, Joe. It is such an honor to be here with this prestigious panel tonight and to welcome our members of the Colorado Foothills World Affairs Council from Evergreen. Thank you for joining us, and it's my pleasure to turn it over to John Krieger from WorldDenver, who we're so pleased to be in partnership with. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb and Joe and Karen. We're also so thankful to be a part of this program and for our partnership with the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council and the Foothills World Affairs Council. We love working together to bring quality programming like this afternoon's program. If you want to learn more about WorldDenver, we're a nonprofit membership organization that facilitates international exchange and global engagement in the Mile High City, and you can learn more about us at worlddenver.org. And with that, I'm happy to hand things over to Karen.
Good afternoon. Welcome to everyone attending today. My name is Karen Burkhart, and I'm the Executive Director of the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council. I join my colleagues in thanking our distinguished visitors, and I'd also like to thank Colorado Foothills World Affairs Council and WorldDenver for yet another successful program collaboration. And also, finally, thank you to all the members and attendees who have continued to support all of us over the past year. You can learn more about the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council at csworldaffairs.org. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen, John, and Deb. I'm sorry to announce that just this morning I was contacted by our plan moderator, Richard Muller, that an urgent family matter required him to go immediately to San Francisco. I imagine right now he'll be boarding a plane at DIA. We will miss him. Richard, who is a member of our council, has had an amazing 37-year diplomatic career. He retired as U.S. Consul General to Hong Kong, serving in the years immediately leading up to Great Britain's handover of Hong Kong to the People's Republic of China. In the mid-70s, Richard was at the U.S. Beijing Embassy as both countries were developing the structure of future U.S. diplomatic relations. We will try to have Richard as a freestanding speaker sometimes in the future. While lacking Richard's gravitas, nonetheless, I will attempt to fill Richard's moderator's shoes this afternoon. Both of our guests this afternoon have distinguished credentials as China experts. You have probably read their abbreviated biographies in our mailings, but I will highlight a few points. Robert Daly directs the Wilson Institute's Kissinger Center on China. Previously, Robert was a diplomat at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing as cultural exchange officer. He is interpreted for many world leaders, including former Chinese President Jiang Zemin and U.S. leaders, including President Jimmy Carter. Multi-talented, he worked on many Chinese television projects as a host, actor, producer, and writer, including producing a Chinese language version of Sesame Street. Professor Suisheng Zhao is a longtime director of DU's Korbel School for International Studies for U.S.-China cooperation. Professor Zhao is also the founder and editor of one of the most respected scholarly journals in the world that addresses contemporary China. His academic degrees are from the University of California, San Diego, Peking University, and the University of Missouri. Today, Professor Zhao will present China's point of view on the important issues both panelists will discuss. We hope to get to many of the audience's questions. Please go to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many as possible. To start things off, Mr. Daly and Professor Zhao will each take a few minutes to identify 3 to 4 issues they believe to be the most critically important to U.S.-China relations. After you have both finished, I hope you will react to one another's list. I will start with Robert Daly.
Well, thanks, Joe. Very glad to be with all of you in Colorado. I enjoyed my previous trips to Grand Junction and Colorado Springs and Denver, where I probably met many of you in person. And I hope I have a chance to see you again in Colorado before too long. And Suisheng, Zhao, it's always great to see you and work with you. I look forward to tonight's conversation, and thank you for the last 2 times you hosted me at the University of Denver. Those were great trips. I thought that rather than hit specific issues, because these are on the front pages of the paper and you know about them, I thought I would highlight 4 thoughts that I hope that you take away at the end of tonight's talk instead. So the first one is that while US-China competition is often badly framed by our leaders, by the media, and it's described in ways that can be very confusing, nevertheless, there are real conflicts of interest between the United States and China in the long term. We are now engaged in what is going to be a high stakes, quite possibly decades long, high cost competition to be the primary influence on worldwide systems. Every country, every region, both poles, cyberspace and outer space. So the competition is very real. And subsequently, a lot of the things I'm going to say are going to emphasize the exaggeration of the competition and the ways that we have to frame it and moderate it a little bit. But I want to be clear that this is a transformational development, the rise of China, which is going to reshape and challenge global systems for the rest of yours and probably your children's and grandchildren's lives as well. It's a major change in the world. Number 2 is that while this is a transformational change, we shouldn't overstate it. And I think that it is being badly overstated now, both in the United States and in China. Americans overstate a China threat in part because of our own fear of decline. China tends to overstate the rivalry with America because of the combination of China's historical sense of victimhood and its current sense of triumphalism, both of which I think affect judgments in Beijing. Furthermore, there are domestic forces in both countries that are tending to encourage adversarial relations between the United States and China, in part to distract from the failings of our own governments in both countries. I also want to emphasize, because there are more and more voices in Washington in particular, but also in Beijing, that are pointing us toward conflict, that are talking about a new Cold War. And in Q&A, we can discuss whether that's a good name for this or not. Both the United States and China are very, very constrained in their ability to focus on the other. You're very familiar with the constraints in America. We have an awful lot of major problems on our hands that have nothing to do with China, like reinvesting in infrastructure and research and development and education, and getting an immigration policy that works and getting a workable healthcare system. These are the priorities for most Americans. They're very expensive, and they're going to constrain our ability to compete with China. And China has a corresponding number of constraints based on its domestic situation. So don't let a lot of alarmist prose coming out of Beijing and Washington worry you over much about this competition. To date, this is not an existential threat that we face from China. And you will hear people in the Senate and Congress describing China as an existential threat. That's a phrase that should not be thrown around lightly. China is in some ways a threat, meaning that we need to be vigilant and we need to improve our own game. But if you say something is an existential threat, that's a threat to your existence. It means please pass the ammo and reload. It's not something that we should just throw around to get people's attention. That's number 2. Number 3 is, because we have so many legitimate concerns about China, there are many voices in Washington that are reasoning from all of our concerns about China toward an eventual conflict. When you list all of the many ways that we disagree with Beijing, it's very hard to avoid the conclusion that we may be heading for conflict. I think that's the wrong way to approach foreign policy. We shouldn't start from our fears and concerns and grope our way forward in the case of China. I think we need to start with the fact that we must not go to war and then reason back toward how to manage the present. These are 2 very large nuclear states. War would be catastrophic, and we need to begin with a recognition of that and then ask very difficult questions like, what are the costs of competition with China really over the long term? Are we willing to pay them? Do we have the ability? Do we have the will to pay them? What accommodations must we make to guarantee that we don't go to war with China? Neither Beijing nor Washington likes to talk about accommodating the other. They both speak as though we self-righteously want what we want and our policy is to get it. And then we talk about what the other guy wants and we say that we have a security dilemma. But in diplomacy, the question is never what do you want? The question is always what will you settle for, given your constraints? And we're not having that conversation. And that leads to the bigger question. In light of this transformational challenge from China and the many other transformational challenges we face, how must China and America change? Our leaders don't want to talk about change. The other guy's supposed to change. So we mustn't go to war. And then lastly, I want to pick up on something that Zhao said, which is the increase in violence against Asian Americans. And I'm very concerned about this for a host of reasons. But the biggest reason going forward is this. For the past year and a half, the rise in violence against Asian Americans has mostly been driven by statements about the coronavirus, that it was China's fault, that China did this to us, that this was a plot. If the coronavirus fades, I'm worried that there's going to be an ongoing stimulus to anti-Asian American racism, and that is the competition between the United States and China, which I've said is high stakes and probably decades long and is very serious and cannot be wished away. So how do we responsibly analyze and describe and prepare for a serious competition with China while not describing the threat in ways that panic people and lead to more violence against America's citizens? That's a really difficult question that I don't think we have an answer for yet, but the danger is real and ongoing. Thanks.
Now, it's always a pleasure to join the WorldDenver Foothills World Affairs Council and the Springs World Affairs Council. And I'm the director of China Center, so we are also part of the program. I'm very proud to be part of the program with my good colleague, Robert Daly. I agree with all what he said so far. In fact, I don't think I need to say anything after listening all what he said, but I still want to make several points here to reinforce what he have talked about. Here, first thing I want to say is that the post-Cold War unipolar moment and then the multipolarity have given way to emerging U.S.-China, emerging bipolar world driven by the U.S.-China competition. In fact, this competition have affected almost every aspect of the global politics and caused a significant global realignment. So from that perspective, what Daly talked about, the real conflicts, interests between these two countries are very true. So scholars have debated what does that mean. Some people have talked about the Cold War, as Robert talked about, starting from Trump declaration of the trade war, technology war, and many other wars, and also including the incitement against the Chinese government, the CCP government. And the Biden administration has not used the term of the Cold War, but has largely continued and getting tough policy and toward China. So this kind of new Cold War, and sometimes even people talk the possibility of the hot war is a very real issue now the scholars are talking about. But some other scholars have taken different approach that the current rivalry between the US and China have not demonstrated those elements of the Cold War, such as the rigid ideological alliances and parity, the military capacity, and separate economic blocks and many other elements. And because of this, what is at stake so high, the Cold War is not what we are experiencing. And these two countries could avoid those conflicts. In fact, in my own view, I think the issue is not if we are in the Cold War or the conflict is inevitable. So what we perceive it. The perceptions, I think, is very important. There's so many misperceptions at this moment, and that would intensify these conflicts. I just want to mention three perceptions here. I think are have played very active roles in these conflicts. One is ideological hostility between the U.S. and China, especially now. Chinese side even thought that Joe Biden now is more threatening than Trump, because he has emphasized democratic values, try to really like-minded democratic countries to confront China. And he talked about the current competition is between democracy versus autocracy. And this perception, I think, is only partially true, because China has indeed had a very different political system, and also hold very different political values from the United States. And to a certain extent, China has been successful to defend, not only defend, but also promote its values in the last decades or so, not only because of the economic success, but also because of the authoritarian government dealing with many crises, from the 2008-2009 financial crisis to the COVID crisis. In fact, the people talk about the COVID when it started as China Chernobyl moment, meaning that the mishandling of the pandemic already damaged the legitimacy of the government, and also with the implication of the politics in the world. But what we have seen is just the opposite. The mobilization capacity of the authoritarian state was very impressive. They quickly controlled the pandemic. Not only controlled the pandemic, they also launched so-called mask diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy, and tried to promote its so-called responsible power image in the world. Not only that, China House has also promoted so-called the China model of the superiority of the China's political system. And in comparison with the disorder and problems handling the crisis in the U.S. and other countries. However, this is not what has been perceived as China's efforts to undermine the democracy, because China has not been like the Soviet Union to be a vanguard to promote its political system globally, and even not like America to promote American liberal democracy globally. My understanding is that what China has done is to let the international community accept China's authoritarian system. In fact, I think China is more afraid of American promotion of liberal democracy than to their own systems. Then they have trying to then the ability to promote its own system, and so that is, I think, one issue here. We should be clear. Simply divide this world into two ideological camps is not the way the world is. That could only intensify the hostility between the U.S. and China. The second issue I want to talk about is the alliances. Because of people talk about Cold War, they talk about the two big powers try to force other countries to take a side in the competition. Indeed, the U.S. has done very powerfully try to push, especially since Joe Biden came to office, to ask their allies, partners, to take side in the competition. And talking about those values, China has been very concerned about those. But I want to tell the Chinese side that the Chinese side, I think themselves are aware of that, is these ideological based alliances cannot be formed. Many countries, including US allies and partners, are not willing to take a side in this contest. Some countries like EU and Australia, Japan, they have taken actions to counter China in fringe of their own interests. But I don't think they are willing to take side in this fight. They are not working with the US because the US leadership on these issues, because their own interests is threatened by China. And on the China side, I also see China tried to build its own partnerships with those authoritarian governments, such as Russia, now Iran. And Prince 60 talk about the alliance, I would say evil alliance of China, Russia, and Iran will be something perceived as a threat, or not existential threat, but there will be a big threat to the US and the Western countries. Indeed, but these three countries, their alignments have not based upon ideological values, but based upon only one thing: the shared sentiments against the US, because they are all threatened by the United States. So US policy, US attitude toward these countries would determine to a great extent their positions toward each other. So there's another perception. I think we have to be clear about alliances. We don't see those kind of alliances today like a Cold War type. The third issue I want to talk about is a delicate balance of power. Each side now has been very confident that we can win in this rivalry. I don't think there will, as Robert talked about, there will be no winner in this competition, because this is very different, like the Cold War with the collapse of one to end it. Neither the US nor China could be defeated in this rivalry. On the China side, China has, in fact, I always told them, they always thought America is in declining. Maybe it's a relative decline, the US, but US still is the most powerful nation in the world. So that perception, I always ask my colleagues, are you sure you are thinking America is declining, you can defeat the United States eventually? And at the first meeting between the Chinese senior diplomats and the US diplomats in Biden administration in Alaska in last month, China said and conveyed 3 points I think was very fresh to me. One is that the US can no longer talking to China from the position of strength. Second, US is in declining. Basically said you have so many internal problems. And the third, US has to change the way to deal with China. That's what the messages I got from that meeting, very interesting meeting. And but I don't think China can match. It's far from matching the US in power capacities and assets, everything, soft power, hard power, everything, even alliances, everything is far. I don't want to get into details, internal problems in China, external problems with other countries, especially in Asia Pacific neighbors. We don't, when we get Q&A, we can talk about that. But on the US side, I would say, I don't think US could easily defeat China as the collapse of Soviet Union in the 1980s, but China is far from the Soviet Union, not only because of the economic size and technology, everything now is not kind of shattering planning economy, everything. But also Chinese government, we like it or not, has had a strong domestic support in its policies to the United States, because China has a lot of legitimate grievance about US policies. Yesterday, I just writing my book, I just got into Yinghe incident. the U.S. Treat China for many years. There's many positive sides, but there are also another hegemonic side. And so the image of U.S. in China is very kind of negative, just like image in China. And the leadership of Xi Jinping, especially during the COVID, after COVID, has been emerged stronger than ever among Chinese leadership, among Chinese elites. So in that case, I don't think these so-called, you cannot, will not say Cold War, but bipolar rivalry could be ended with the defeat of one side. So in that case, we really have to find ways to live within this competition. So I'll stop here.
Robert, would you like to comment?
Well, I know you have some other questions, Joe. I agree with Suisheng that this talk about winning the future, winning the competition, doesn't really accurately reflect what we're going for. I don't think that the Biden administration's goal is to defeat China or overthrow the Chinese Communist Party within China's territory. The goal is to restrict China's illiberal influence beyond China's borders, to use alliances and to use other methods to make sure that we don't live in a world that is more amenable to a communist party that is in fact more repressive at home and more aggressive internationally. And while the United States cannot win, I think that's true in a Cold War sense, because so many other nations which really value their economic relations with China do not welcome China's political or strategic influence. And international public opinion polling shows this. You know, the United States under Donald Trump, we bled out soft power all around the world. But interestingly, China was not able to step into that vacuum. If you look at elite opinion and public opinion, even in countries on China's doorstep, countries that have unquestionably gained from trading with China, they're deeply distrustful about Xi Jinping's intentions within the region. So I think that the name of the game in terms of the competition is to limit China's illiberal influence. Not all Chinese influence is illiberal. China's providing more and more public goods beyond China's borders. It's not to try to affect the overthrow of the Communist Party within China.
I agree that maybe that's the wrong word, to defeat, to win. But here, at least from what I talk to Chinese colleagues, is that the U.S. has wanted to slow, if not stop, China's rise by using all economic, political, and diplomatic instruments. So that's what they thinks about. And also, of course, I think influence is also a very important aspect. Here, the two issues are, one is, can the U.S. stop China's rise? I don't think U.S. could stop China. I don't know how U.S. could stop China's rise. Xi Jinping now has, I think he's a dictator for sure, but he's a very smart dictator and knows China's situation, how to run this country. He has met a lot of very important proposals, including what now they have so-called dual circulation. And China started economic growth as export net growth and using international market. But now they have tried, they know the international environment has been very severe for them. So they have tried to make use of domestic market to develop indigenous technology. In fact, the 1.4 billion population is a very big market, and a lot of tenants in China. And China has developed to the level that just have to find a breakthrough. And so in that context, China cannot be easily defeated or but stopped here. But on the other hand, I think Robert is correct that the influence China's both soft power and hard power influence has been very limited.
We have to, so, and we speak of China's rise, that has at least two different senses. One is within China, the very rapid increase in the material, economic, technological well-being of the Chinese people, better health outcomes, better education outcomes. This is all fantastic for China and potentially fantastic for the world. But then there's the question of whether the world wants to be governed the way that China is governed. There's this question of overseas influence. So when most American politicians or journalists say that China's rise is a threat, what they usually mean is China's reach for global leadership is something that we need to limit. They're not saying that we want to harm Chinese people on Chinese soil. And obviously there is a connection between China's wealth and China's power. That gets a little more complicated. But we need to distinguish between different meanings of China's rise, I think, in this conversation.
And I agree with that too. The influence part, I don't think most countries in the world would want to live under China's authoritarian role. And so in that case, talking about China's existential threat to the way of life in the West or in the world, I think is exaggeration, because that's not appeal to many other countries. But on the other hand, I would say that some of the China's demands, for example, in the global order, which has been constructed under U.S. leadership and dominated by the United States. Trump tried to dismantle what the U.S. established global order, which is liberal. And China has a lot of complaints about the U.S.-led liberal order, has insisted on the sovereignty, what I call the statist, state-centered order, giving states a lot of leeways to push back against liberal order, liberal values, which I think has been accepted by a lot of countries in the world, especially because of U.S. failure to promote democracy in many countries, especially using forces to promote democracy. Now, for example, in the UN Human Rights Council, China has very often put the U.S. at the minority. U.S. dropped 2018, but China has, for example, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibet on those issues. In the Human Rights Council, China had a majority to support them. The UK bill was voted only 27 countries. I don't want to say China's action, those countries are legitimate, but here is the international community. You see, China's influence on those issues has been very powerful. And we have to be very cautious how to distinguish on these issues with its own domestic aspects. And the US and the international community have to understand how to compete with China on those issues.
Zhao, should we go back to you?
Let me unmute myself. We've been talking about some of the hopes and fears, with U.S.-China relations. Let me have you address something else, maybe more realistically. Would you both speculate on what realistic outcomes we might expect in the next 5 to 10 years? What do you think and what do you hope will be the relationship between China and the U.S. in the coming decade?
Suisheng, why don't you go first?
Okay, I will say the competition will define the cooperation. And the competitive aspects of these two countries are, as Robert said, very real. Economic competition and security competition, and also a value system. The three aspects are very real. So each side has to compete to defend their own interests, but not at expense of the other. I think that's a very important part. The Trump competition with China is to rush to the bottom, just to bring you down, see who is more kind of evil. In that case, China had to respond to that type of competition. And the competition should go to who can do better. who can handle its own domestic issues better, to get support domestic issues better, and also in the international arena could use their influence to improve international community well-being of the international community, and also provide international public goods. In fact, what I'm concerned, one concern in the competition globally is that because of US now said, Joe Biden said, US is back, but US capacity to provide international public goods has been declined for sure. And China talked a lot of they are going to provide public goods. China has not stepped in, and the vacuum left by United States. So these two countries should compete to see who could provide better values, better economic models, and also better material public goods to the United States community. In the meantime, these two countries, I think we have so many shared interests, not only on the climate change and also the pandemic and weapons of mutual mass destruction and many other issues, just how we can find ways to collaborate on those issues. At this time, I think the problem for these two countries is that we all talk about shared interests, but neither side is willing to step up to emphasize their own responsibility on those shared interests. They also always put fingers on this other side. You have not done enough on those issues. So the leaders, these two countries, have to really try to work on those issues. Final point I want to mention here is the communication. I found the miscommunication and very often cut off the communication during the Trump years is a great threat. Doesn't matter what kind of conflict interest, doesn't matter what kind of issues we have to talk to each other. We have to have not only communication exchanges. Now, I think Joe Biden administration is going to the right direction, but not strong enough. For example, peace call and the exchange of students and many other issues. We can really try to start. On the China side, I'll tell them the same thing. Try to have a good communication, try to have a good exchange. These 3 points I want to make.
Regarding outcomes, I really don't expect an outcome in 5 to 10 years. You'll notice that at any given moment, we never feel like we're in the midst of an outcome. We always feel like we're in the midst of a muddle. And I think that it's going to be a very long muddle. But your question, where are we trying to get? This is a key question, and this is something that I think is missing from American strategy. We're very clear about the ways in which we're worried about China, but we're not clear on what would be an acceptable state of affairs to us that would make us less worried. This hasn't really been articulated. I do think, and this comes back to something Suisheng said, that if you posit some acceptable future in US-China relations, it has to be one in which China is still a powerful country, still a wealthy country, and is still run by the Chinese Communist Party. If you're not positing that, you're indulging in wishful thinking. You're just sort of wishing away the Communist Party. So how do we get there? I think what saves us really is multilateralism. I don't think it's going to be a bipolar world. I think it will be more multilateral. One of the big mistakes that we make in talking about US-China relations is speaking as if they're the only two countries in the world. And when you speak that way, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that it's going to be, daggers drawn sooner rather than later. But other areas, Europe, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, all of our interests in these areas, all of the activities of these other countries mitigate against the worst tendencies of China and the United States and serve as a sort of a buffer. My own view is that we should not be asking countries to choose between China or the United States. What we should seek is a form of diplomacy in which we encourage other countries to have the best possible relationship that they can with both great powers, but on their own terms. That is to say, under terms that are transparent and reciprocal and uncoerced. Precisely because of globalization and all of our complex relations with each other. If India, for example, which has been leaning more toward the American side, but will never lean absolutely toward the American side. if India had an acceptable relationship on India's terms with China and the United States, and if Indonesia and ASEAN, again, had an acceptable relationship with both powers on their own terms, and then around the world, if that were true, this would necessarily involve China and the United States in networks of complexity and compromise that I think are our greatest guarantee against going to war. And so I think that encouraging that kind of multilateralism is the best way to go. In terms of combating Chinese influence, I think our single biggest slogan or weapon internationally in our diplomacy should be transparency. Transparency, transparency, transparency. No secret agreements with China. No secret memoranda of understanding. If all of this is public, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't do so well in daylight. Secrecy and a sort of a paranoid style are really baked in fundamentally to the Communist Party's way of operating. If their contracts, if their tenders for major infrastructure projects, if their loan programs or aid programs internationally are all transparent and will be viewed by the people of that country, then China is defanged, that it's less able to spread illiberal practices and more likely to be a force for good. We also have to pay more attention to the changes in China, and the same could be said about the United States, but in the interest of time, I'll stick with China because Xi Jinping is a dictator. He's taking China from authoritarianism to techno-totalitarianism really quite quickly, and many people in China are deeply worried about this. And because he's also aggressive internationally. We've tended to speak about China as though it has stopped changing and it's moving in one negative direction. And that's a misperception. The story of modern China is the story of change, and it's still changing. And if you follow sort of the news cycle about daily life in China, you see this. There's a lot of advocacy for change. You've got something like a Me Too movement among Chinese women. You have Chinese stand-up comics, women comics, women rock bands who are advocating for much more equitable relations between men and women in China. That's potentially transformative. You've got older people in China who are being asked to work longer. One of the ways they're trying to get around the graying of the population is to extend the retirement age. And you've got the old people saying, we don't want to work longer. They're pushing back. You've got younger people who the government is trying to encourage to marry and have more children saying, no, we don't want that either. We want to marry later or not at all and have fewer children. There's a lot of pushback against the surveillance state. There are people advocating for greater privacy laws in China. So the government, even though it's moving toward totalitarianism, really doesn't control the flow and the churn in Chinese society any more than ours does. So we need policies, and this is why I talk about a gradual multilateralism, that are essentially a play for time. We need to let time do its work to change both countries, China and the United States. And I think that a multilateral approach is probably the best one.
From the audience, there are a couple interrelated questions dealing with, as we look into the future 5 or 10 years out, where do you think Taiwan will be in that equation? Are we right to fear the possibility of an armed invasion? One of the audience asks.
Suisheng?
I think China has lost patience on Taiwan because of 3 changes. One is the balance power across the Taiwan Strait between mainland China and Taiwan, and also between China and the United States. China has thinking that it has increased capacities to take over Taiwan by force, and also to prevent the U.S. from intervention. That's one change in mind in Chinese leaders. Second is they are concerned about Taiwan's drifting away from China, and because Taiwan's democracy and Taiwan self-identity has been increased in those years, and also Taiwan people have a lot of negative impressions of China, although China is doing in their own mind well, and also DPP is in power for already 2nd term now, Tsai Ing-wen, and there's no hope that KMT will return to power anytime soon. Even they return power, they will not be able to reverse the trend. Third is the U.S. Change attitudes on Taiwan. They thought U.S. now has tried since Trump, in fact, even before Trump, Obama time, already tried to enhance the ties with Taiwan. Now, even Joe Biden came to office, he has sent former his best friend from former senator, what's his name, Zhao, and a senior U.S. diplomats, former U.S. diplomats to Taiwan, and also allowed the Taiwan's representative in Washington to attend his inauguration. And there are many signs from China's side. The U.S. would only try to use Taiwan to balance China, to counter China. So in that case, I'm very, very concerned talking to my friends in China. This kind of Wutong, the armed military unification voice has take up hand. And I don't know when China will take action, but all those signs has been very clear that China has been impatient. And but I don't think that's in China's interest to do that. I try to convince my friends in China, this is totally wrong decision. The cost is not. China cannot take back Taiwan by force, period.
Robert, yes,
I would just add, I think that was a very good analysis. A fourth factor, which is the political character and ambition of Xi Jinping, who is setting himself up quite clearly as leader for life, who has said in two separate speeches, one, that the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation must be accomplished by 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic. He said that in one speech. And separately, he has said that the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation cannot be complete unless Taiwan is reabsorbed. So that sounds like a 1949 deadline to reabsorb, which means invade and occupy and force Taiwan. And 1949 is tomorrow. So Xi Jinping is also part of the problem here. That said, I do think that America could have far more deft diplomacy to reassure China. A colleague of mine at the Wilson Center, Ambassador Stapleton Roy, often points out correctly that relations between Beijing and Taiwan have been best for the people of Taiwan from Taiwan's own point of view when Beijing had the highest degree of confidence in its relations with the United States. In other words, when China isn't too worried about the United States, it tends to be a little bit more open-handed with Taiwan and a little more generous. And we have given China increasing reason not to be confident about its relations with us. And in part, we've had to because of the way that Xi Jinping has been pushing. I think that if we make clear that we're going to deal with Taiwan within the One China framework as we interpret it, and if especially, and here I agree strongly with Suisheng, if we just start talking to China, we can reassure them. Biden now has a date for a summit with Putin. If you can talk to Putin, you can talk to Xi Jinping. And it's time for them to start meeting in person. Don't expect a great outcome the first time, but the very process of talking tends to enable the bureaucracies, get the bureaucracies to pay attention to these issues, to talk with each other more. It puts the brakes on escalating rhetoric that we've seen in both countries. And so I don't know if we need a whole strategic and economic dialogue, but we definitely need a leaders summit as soon as possible. In fact, we need a series of them.
So let me add one point here. In the past, I always give us three sides, each one sentence advice. For China, I said to be patient. For Taiwan, not to have a surprise. For the US, stay on course. So that's what the three sentences I want to have given to the three sides. I think that still is the case. But on the US side, stay on course, I'm a little bit uncertain at this time. In fact, I just had a dialogue with Taiwan side and also the Chinese side. I said I want to say U.S. should trust Chinese wisdoms cross Taiwan Strait to resolve the problems among themselves. But next, I'm confident in their wisdoms to resolve those problems among themselves. U.S. has to play a role, a positive role. I don't know how now at this time.
But bottom line is that mishandling of the Taiwan question is the most likely cause for direct conflict between the United States and China. So it is becoming more dangerous, but I don't think it's true that Xi Jinping has a date certain set to bring Taiwan back into the fold. I think that there is still room for diplomacy.
Another real hot button issue that's out there, and it's in our questions too, is the whole issue. China internationally seems to have a big black eye for their treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. How is that going to be resolved?
Well, I'm going to say something very pessimistic, and it's going to sound awful. This is not a prescription. I'm not saying this is what should happen. But in Xinjiang and in Tibet, Beijing has really two policies. One is flood the zone, have more and more Han Chinese move into these vast areas until the minority peoples, the Tibetans and people and the Uyghurs and other people of Xinjiang right now they're the majority in these areas until the Tibetans and the native people of the Xinjiang region become a minority. So flood the zone with Han and dilute that way. And then there's another series of policies related which have to do with assimilation of minority peoples such that they are more like and more associated with the Han over time. And then obviously there's the police power, there's the coercive power that we see in these re-education camps in Xinjiang. And what I'm going to say, which is bleak, is that this almost certainly succeeds from Beijing's point of view. I do think that's where this goes, and I don't think that there's too much that the outside world can do about it, although we are absolutely correct to be calling attention to what's happening there. In fact, this is Chinese territory. Every country recognizes it as Chinese territory. There are no perfect historical analogies, and this one isn't perfect either. But I think that what's happening in Xinjiang and what's happening, going to happen in Tibet, is ongoing in Tibet, can be analogized to what we did to American Indian populations. I think that that's where this goes over the long term, no matter how much noise we make.
I agree with what Robert said. An international committee could only put some pressures on China on these issues, but have to be very cautious and also to be precise. There, among many people in China, they really thought the U.S. is using this issue to stigmatize China and, for example, genocide argument, which I don't know. I talked to my friend in China. I don't know if that's what's happening in China. There are camps, labor camps. They are police forces, but they are not taught to that level. So international committee should pay attention to this, try to put pressures on China. But as Robert said, it's international law, this kind of world of nation states. We only can hope China further developed those consciousness among the Chinese people and also among Chinese politicians will come up to find ways to resolve that, not resolve that issue, but to have a better relationships within those so-called ethnic groups in China.
The statute, the United Nations statute that defines genocide is extremely vague. I recommend that people who are interested in this question read it. It's very short, and it includes a couple of different actions, some of which China is clearly involved in Xinjiang. But the key phrase is it says it's an attempt to destroy in whole or in part. And destroy here doesn't just mean kill. There's a number of other different definitions that are in play here. To destroy in whole or in part a racial, ethnic, or religious group as such. So the question is, what does as such mean? And when you say as whole or in part, well, how small a part counts? It's not clear. I think there's a clear reading of the genocide statute that enables us to say, yes, this is genocide. And then people who want to say, well, the statute was written as a response to the Holocaust, they tend to say this is clearly not like the Holocaust, so that it's not genocide. But the statute is written, I think, permits both interpretations. It's not a slam dunk either way.
Another question, and the time is, we maybe can go over a little bit, but in international relations, indeed, in any kind of relations, you're always looking at a way to take an advantage, a spot to take advantage of in the relationship. What is the weak spot that China is looking at the U.S., and what is the U.S. looking as a weak spot in China that they can maximize for their own benefit?
Let me talk about China side, then Robert can talk American side. I think China time is on China side. Yeah. China is rising, and China is going to overtake United States eventually. Although per capita GDP will be still far behind. China has 1.4 billion population. Now it's about 10% or 15%. Even 1/3 of the US GDP, China will be much bigger size of economy over United States. So if China could sustain the current competition and let US to decline, that's what I think. US internal problems would work out. Then China would be able to, I will not say win, when I use this term, but China will not lose in the competition.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. From the Chinese point of view, 9/11 and the failure of the forever wars, put the lie to America's military might. 2008 and the financial crisis put the lie to the notion that America had the best economic and financial models. And then 2016 and the 2020 elections that are aftermath put the lie to democracy and American institutional strength. So China it counts America's capabilities, but it's not cowed. I think that what Suisheng said is extremely important. On the other side, I wouldn't exactly say that Chinese Communist Party, they're not really the kings of introspection and self-knowledge. They're altogether too confident. And I think that they are blind to what we see as their biggest weak spot, which is their sclerotic politics. And the fact from our point of view, we'll see where it goes, that they're wrong about what people want, that they're wrong that people are willing to de-emphasize the role of the individual and to serve the state and not pursue social and political freedoms. We think they're wrong about that. We think that that is their great blind spot. We think most of the people in the world agree with us, and that she is going in exactly the wrong direction, which is showing up a lot of the fragilities within China. And so I think that is various forms of that are their blind spot. You're going to hear this summer, China's celebrating the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. They take over China in 1949. They're going to make a big deal of this. Well, this was a party in 1921, a really small cell in Shanghai that borrowed Leninism from the Soviet Union and tried to adapt it to a desperately poor, agricultural, revolutionary nation. And that's still the Leninist structure of the Chinese Communist Party, despite the fact that most Chinese are urbanized, educated, internationalized, entrepreneurial, ambitious. How can this party continue to serve the needs of these people, once the thrill of not being desperately poor wears off and they want to move up to the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and actually express themselves and have a say in their politics? That's where the Communist Party probably ceases to serve their needs.
Well, this may be the last question. I guess it's looking a little bit at fantasy. And if you close your eyes for a minute and you wake up and you're at a bar, let's say in Beijing, with Biden, Xi, both of you with your Peugeot and Mao Tai, what would you want to talk about? Just the four of you off the record.
The four of us off the record. I would, in light of what Suisheng, I think Suisheng just described China's ideas about about American decline. I would like Xi Jinping to say that to Biden's face and let Biden respond. And I would like to hear Biden say some form of what I just said about the weakness of Chinese politics and hear Xi respond.
I think they might just point out to each other what you have been wrong about us. That's, I think they would talk about. Xi Jinping would tell him, in fact, the 2 hours conversation they had during China-U.S. And Biden said that Xi Jinping told him, your democracy will not work. And you cannot make any decisions. You cannot put things together. You have to have the power what we have. Joe Biden could tell him that's totally wrong. And the democracy has its own, has virginity, fragility, but also resilience. And also from Joe Biden's side, he might also heard from Xi Jinping about how the resilience of authoritarianism in China and how the Chinese development so far has proved that their system is successful. And so this kind of misperceptions try to be cleared.
And if I'd had a few drinks, I might ask Xi Jinping why he thought it was that so many millions of people are still trying to get into the United States while they're trying to get out of China. And I would also point out that while it's true that we initially handled the COVID pandemic extremely badly and we're still recovering from that, and that yes, while their authoritarianism allowed them after initial mistakes to perform better, when we get vaccines and come out of COVID, they'll still be authoritarian and we'll still be free in a competition that is mostly about innovation and technology. So let's see how that works out.
Thank you both.
Also, I think they can ask how your daughter, I mean, Xi Jinping's daughter was at Harvard. How did she learn?
Yeah.
Any closing comments either of you want to have?
As soon as we can, I'd love to come back out to Colorado and see you in person.
And
Yeah.
we will plan on that.
Definitely.
Suisheng and Robert, if you could stay on after we sign off and with the people from the different sponsoring groups, just have a couple minutes with you, I would appreciate it. But thank you to the audience very much. I hope that you've had a stimulating afternoon and evening. And thank you very much to both of you for your insights. Very valuable. Thank you.
Thank you.